Okay, in today's class we're going to switch gears, and instead of talking about the Greek world again, we're looking a little bit more west, to the rise of ancient Rome, to the rise, in this class at least, of the Roman Republic. I'll begin, as I guess I normally do begin some of these classes, by asking you guys a question. What did the Romans ever do for us? And obviously I can't listen to your responses, but there are some kind of permanent legacies left to us by the Roman Republic, and then later on the Roman Empire. The first is in language. The Latin language obviously was used by the ancient Romans, but that went on to essentially be the mother language, or the original language, which gives us French, Spanish, Romanian, Portuguese, Italian. They are the main Romance languages that are used in Europe today. Another example of the influence of ancient Rome comes in Christianity. As we'll see, not in this class, but in a later class, Christianity essentially spread along where the Roman Empire already existed. And so there is actually a strong overlap between the organization of the Roman Empire and its territories it conquered, and the original spread of Christianity as well. The Romans were obviously enormously influential in Roman law, and so much so that, especially in European law, large parts of European law are still very heavily influenced by the legal system that existed in ancient Rome. We'll talk about that a bit more, I guess, in a later class, but just so you're aware of it. The Romans obviously had made huge contributions to the field of architecture and art, which we'll look at as well. And then finally, in kind of forging a kind of Western Roman Empire, they were the first ones to really create a sense of a unified European identity. And obviously that is kind of represented today by the European Union, the existence of the European Union. But the initial kind of coalescing of these very actually diverse groups of people started with the Roman Empire as well. So the Romans in some ways did a lot for us. Okay. The birth of Rome itself, let's start at the very beginning, or at least the legendary beginning of ancient Rome. It was founded, according to legend, by two twins that were suckled by a she-wolf. And what was the name of these twins? They were Romulus and Remus. They were abandoned, according to legend, at birth. They were suckled by a she-wolf, as you saw in the picture there. Eventually they grew up, they founded the city, or basically Romulus built the walls that would become the walls of Rome itself. Remus kind of made fun of his walls. He didn't think they were very big, and Romulus killed him. So a contentious beginning, I guess, for the ancient Roman Empire. So according to legend, Rome was formed by Romulus and Remus. Rome is actually named after Romulus in particular, and raised by a twin wolf. And I think this speaks in some ways to the martial kind of identity that the ancient Romans had, that they believed they were kind of teak tough. They were raised by wild kind of creatures. Romulus killed Remus when he was unhappy at him, laughing at him. So this is the very origins of ancient Rome, at least in the stories they told themselves, speak to a certain amount of toughness connected with it. And what was the name of the river that Rome was built on, and of course still stands on today? That river is the Tiber. So Rome actually, in historical fact, was a small village on the river Tiber, and it was part of a wider kind of loose coalition of Roman-speaking or Latin-speaking people that were known as the Latins. So the city of Rome was one of several kind of cities that spoke the Latin language, and was a kind of a tribe in central Italy. In the same way that the ancient cities of Sumer spoke a common language, but they were divided amongst themselves. Certainly the way the ancient Greeks, again, had a common language, but were divided into various settlements. The Romans initially were part of a wider identity in central Italy called the Latin identity, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Its position on the Tiber was kind of fortuitous. The Tiber was deep enough to allow kind of trading fleets, boats of peace essentially, to navigate up the river and to trade with Rome, but it was not deep enough that war fleets could come up in the same way. So it was kind of it took at a fortuitous kind of location in the center of Rome. It was also easily defended by land, and so this kind of allowed Rome to kind of develop itself as a kind of strong trading post. According to legend, Rome was established by Romulus in 753 BC, although actually archaeological records show that the history of ancient Rome predates that. It's at least 300 or 400 years older than the Romans themselves thought they were. According to legend, Rome was originally a monarchy, and it was ruled by 7 kings. The last of these kings was a guy called Tarquin, or more accurately, Tarquin Superbus. And according to some legend, he was actually an Etruscan, and Etruscan were the kind of people who lived in the territories to the north of the Latins, or of the ancient Romans. Tarquinius Superbus had a son, Tarquin as well, and according to legend, so the story actually comes up here is the story of Lucretia, which was one of the important kind of foundation myths of ancient Rome. So Lucretia was the wife of a guy called Colonnatus. Colonnatus and Lucretia were very devoutly devoted to one another, and one time when Colonnatus was out with an army, he met some of the other kind of noble officers, and he was kind of boasting about, or they were all actually boasting about, whose wife was the most kind of virtuous and the most kind of in sync with Rome's love and establishment of morality. And Colonnatus knew hands down that his own wife was. So they basically snuck around and kind of figured out what each wife was doing at that time, as they when their husbands were away. And Lucretia, Colonnatus's wife, was sewing with her handmaids, and that was considered to be the most virtuous of all the officers' wives. And so Colonnatus kind of won the bet, or won a prize. But Tarquin was amongst the men, and when he saw Lucretia, he saw how kind of beautiful she was, and that night, when the men had returned to their camp and they weren't with their wives, Tarquin kind of snuck in upon Lucretia and basically demanded that she sleep with him, or he would blackmail her, or so essentially he would say he would kill Lucretia. He would kill a slave and say that he had actually came upon the slave and Lucretia having sex, and so kind of disgraced Lucretia, and Lucretia refused, and so in the end Tarquin raped Lucretia, and Lucretia, she went and she had reported that, so Sextus Tarquin is the son of Tarquin Superbus. She reported the story to her father and to her husband, that Tarquin had raped her. And what did she do once she reported the story? She killed herself. And in some ways that kind of speaks to the extent to which Lucretia was the idolized Roman woman, that once she was disgraced in the eyes of the gods and of society, there was no kind of course left to her, or at least in the idealized setting of the story, than to actually commit suicide. And so she committed suicide. A lot of people were outraged that Tarquin had committed this kind of atrocity, and so they rebelled, and they not only did they hunt down Tarquin, but they actually overthrew his father, Tarquin Superbus, as well, and that was the end of the Roman monarchy. So Tarquin and the monarchy was overthrown. And it was instead replaced by, well, I'll say more in a second, but a political system that did not have a king. And actually, for a long time in Rome, to be a king was the most hateful kind of thing that one could do. It's in some ways there's a rough parallel with the modern United States, that to be seen as a kind of a king is kind of to go against the fundamental ideals behind the foundation of the nation. So oftentimes the political enemies of, I mean, whoever the president is, so they would say President Trump, he's acting like a king, or Joe Biden is acting like a king, or whatever it is. And ancient Rome was even more pronounced kind of hatred of kings. So this is the origins of ancient Rome. The early republic. So the political system that was left behind essentially was what the Romans didn't even have really a name for it. It just became known as the res publica. Eventually, the public thing. That is to say, it's something the government is governed, broadly speaking, by the people. Although actually, what that means in Rome in the centuries before Christ is something actually very different from what it means in the 21st century. But the idea was that it was the government of the people as opposed to being governed by a single man. And Rome combined this kind of experiment with republican government with a kind of growing expansion across the Italian peninsula. And Rome was quickly able to firstly conquer the other Latin cities in the center of Italy, but beyond that, it actually began to kind of extend its influence across the Italian peninsula. And the question I have here is, how did the Romans treat those they conquered? And they treated those they conquered in a way that allowed them to successfully build an empire. The short answer was they didn't impose really heavy taxes upon the people. They did demand, of course, that the people supplied, the conquered people supplied soldiers who could serve in the Roman army, but they didn't actually impose a heavy tax. And they extended what was called the Latin Rite to all. The Latin Rite initially initiated amongst the Latin people of central Italy. The three main kind of markers of the Latin Rite were: one, it was kind of a free trade relationship, was exposed to exist between all these kind of Latin cities. So if you were a trader in Rome or a different Latin city, you could enter your goods into another Latin city kind of free of charge. The second right was that it provided for intermarriage between Latins in these different cities. And again, that might not sound all that generous, but that is actually a marked difference from example, what happened in ancient Greece, where there was a lot of suspicion between the Greek city-states. In central Italy, at least, there was much more willingness to kind of acknowledge intermarriage, welcome trade, and the third aspect of the Latin Rite was... I'm blanking on it for a second. Yeah, I'll come back to that in a second. I don't know why it suddenly... No, it's in there somewhere, but it's not coming at the moment, so I'll come back to that. Rome also dedicated itself to war in a way that was, I wouldn't say totally unique within ancient societies, but certainly was more pronounced than most of the societies we saw. We have come across professional militaries before. Philip of Macedon, for example, had a professional army that he trained vigorously in order to wield the sarissas and to fight in phalanxes. The Roman legions were organized into, the Romans themselves organized their army into legions, which is about 5,000 men. But actually the kind of, the standard day-to-day operating units were what were called the manusses, essentially groups of 120 men that oftentimes specialized in different aspects of war. And so this is what made Rome more kind of dangerous to its enemies than other kind of ancient people had been. That the first they very much have a warlike kind of outlook in general, reflecting again the fact that they I'm trying to think that they kind of saw themselves kind of in the beginning, even with the story of Romulus, as from the very beginning kind of tough fighters interacting with nature. They don't really kind of like kind of soft sedentary kind of lifestyles, but then they also kind of specialize. So there would be soldiers who specialize in how to build dams, or soldiers who specialize in how to build pontoon bridges across rivers, soldiers who specialized in throwing javelins, soldiers who specialize in slingshots, soldiers who specialize in close, heavy hand-to-hand combat. So this kind of specialization within its military made it exceptionally flexible, exceptionally adaptable to every condition they were encountering, and that's what made their military successful. That, and the fact it was obviously huge as well. I mean, the Roman army in around 300 AD was about 300,000 men. So that was an enormous army, and it was partly because they expected the people they conquered in Italy to provide men for the army. And so when these when these men were finished as soldiers, what did the average Roman aspire to be? What did the ancient Romans want to be? Well, they wanted to be farmers. Ancient Rome had a fixation on military affairs, on battle, but also the fixation on agriculture and settling in farms. And this marks them actually as different from certainly the ancient Phoenicians or the ancient Greeks, who very quickly kind of found much more value in trade and seafaring and extending the kind of trade networks across the Mediterranean. The Romans, on the other hand, wanted to be farmers, and so part of the reason that they went out and conquered all these new territories was to provide more and more farmland for their ever-growing army. So the idea was you serve in the army for about 20 years and then you settle down to become a farmer. And the most famous farmer, I guess, in this mold was a guy called Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus is the guy pictured here. He was a Roman of the patrician class, so he was from the kind of elite in Roman society. But he also was a farmer, so he farmed his own kind of land. And according to legends, it depends on which legend you view. Some say this happened only once, others say it happened twice. But in 458 BC, Rome was being attacked by some enemies. It needed kind of strong, effective government, and so they appointed Cincinnatus to be dictator. Dictator at this time does not have the negative connotation that it comes that comes later on. Dictator simply meant that someone who total control was placed in the government in their hands for 6 months. So Cincinnatus went out, he defeated Rome's enemies, and retired to his farm afterwards. Went back to rather than trying to, I guess, hang on to power, he returned the power to the Roman Senate, to the people of Rome, and retired as a farmer. And so, in the way that Lucretia was the kind of the feminine ideal for what the ancient Romans should be, Cincinnatus in many ways was the male kind of equivalent, the ideal kind of male who can be a farmer, can be a soldier, can be a politician, but ultimately his love is of farming first and foremost. So again, that's why farming was a very central component of ancient Rome. And the Society of the Cincinnati was created in 1783 to preserve the ideals of the Continental Army. Fittingly, this man was named President General until his death in 1799. And so obviously the city of Cincinnati also gets its name from Cincinnatus. And who was this guy who was appointed as President of the Society of the Cincinnati? Obviously George Washington. Okay. How did Roman government work? Well, it worked in a couple of ways. Essentially, Rome was dominated by the kind of wealthier elites in society, and these wealthy elites voted on 2 consuls every year to act as governors. In some ways, the system is not all that removed from a monarchy. But there's a couple of kind of exceptions. One, rather than there being one single monarch, there are 2 monarchs, and these monarchs have almost unlimited powers, or these consuls have almost unlimited powers, except one can veto the other. And so occasionally there was kind of stalemate in the leadership of Rome. But for the most part, consuls were usually able to get at least something done. They at least could agree on some things. They also, of course, were only in power for 1 year, right, after which they had to stand aside or stand for election again at least. So the idea was that unlike a monarchy, which was a preserving system of government where someone could dominate for years, every year, I guess, the citizens of Rome, and that again is mostly the wealthy elites, would elect a consul. If they didn't like a consul, they could replace him. And again, what was the Roman name for aristocrats? What was the Roman name for the lower classes? Both names start with P, and the answer you should get is the patrician class, were the Roman elites. That comes essentially from patris, meaning father. Most of these aristocratic Roman families were descended from a famous ancestor in their lineage. On the other hand, the Roman plebeians, or plebs, this actually made up 98% of the Roman population. But they were not citizens. That's to say that you had to have a certain amount of land. You essentially had a certain amount of wealth in order to be a citizen, and they had few kind of political rights as well. And so, while the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic is expanding, there's always this kind of tension at home between power being wielded by the patricians and the plebeians demanding kind of more power. In fact, what could the plebeians do to try and improve their situation? Well, they could effectively go on strike. And that's what they did in the end, near the end of the 4th century BC. They went on strike, and eventually, when Rome was under military threat, and they forced the patricians to kind of give them their own kind of special council, a plebeian assembly that was led by tribunes, and the tribunes were elected by the plebeian assembly. And this I guess change to Roman law was one of the things that was codified in the Law of the 12 Tables around 450 BC. In some ways, the Law of the 12 Tables is almost like an earlier form of Magna Carta, at least in the Roman sense, that it was codifying a lot of law, although actually in many ways it was putting down on paper what had already existed in some cases for a couple of centuries, and how the Roman government was to be administered. Another plebeian victory in 287 BC meant that not only did the plebeians have their own assembly, not only did they have their own tribunes who represented the people, but they went further and insisted that any law that was passed by the plebeian assembly became Roman law. regardless of what the upper class Senate thought of it. So we have power balance between the plebeians of the plebeian assembly and the Roman Senate and the consuls who act as an executive power or executive kind of power. So Rome was not a democracy. I mean, most people could vote in the plebeian assembly. Most people did not really have say on the Senate or the election of consuls, but power was balanced between the three kind of bodies, and in some ways this kind of serves as a precursor to the modern American Republic. The founding fathers were very influenced by the ideas of ancient Rome, and were kind of deeply admired this kind of sense of power being balanced between different factions. Okay. If we were in class today, we would be looking at the law of the 12 tables and discussing it, but we're not in class today, so we will move on to actually talking about the Punic Wars. So the Punic Wars were fought between Rome and this city, which was founded by the Phoenicians. And what city was this? This city was Carthage. So as Rome had managed to kind of conquer much of the Italian peninsula by the 3rd century BC, this brought it increasingly into conflict with Carthage, which again was established by the Phoenicians, which was kind of a large maritime empire, as you can see from the map here, which governed over large parts of the southern Mediterranean, or certainly the coastline of the southern Mediterranean was a kind of rich, wealthy trading power in the Mediterranean Sea. Carthage again was a strong naval and commercial power. It's today, or at least the city today, if it existed, and it doesn't, because of what happens at Rome. But the territory was in modern Tunisia, in North Africa, and increasingly there was conflict between the Romans and the Carthaginians over some of the territories that the Carthaginians have. In particular, what territory did the Carthaginians have that the Romans wanted? They had Sicily. So Sicily is right off the toe of Italy, but it was largely a Carthaginian colony. And so in 264 BC, Rome went to war with Carthage in order to firstly just to acquire Sicily. And actually this is where the word Punic War even comes from. So from the Romans called the Carthaginians the Poeni, again reflecting their ancient origin as Phoenicians essentially. And so that from that term we get the Punic Wars. So war broke out in 264 BC. It didn't really go all that well for Rome initially. That the Carthaginians, they fought one land battle with Rome and they realized that was enough, that they didn't want any more of the Roman military, but they had a much more powerfully established navy. And so they managed to essentially hold off the Romans and kind of inflict defeats upon them until the Romans went and created their own navy. Rome did not really have a navy prior to the First Punic War, but it created one in response to Carthage and its very superior kind of naval superiority, and ground down the Carthaginians. So this war was about 25 years long, the First Punic War. In the end, Carthage was beaten. Sicily kind of was handed over to the Roman Empire, and not just was Sicily handed over to the Roman Empire, but the Romans insisted that the Carthaginians also pay an annual fee to compensate themselves for the cost of the war. The Romans and in the next decade or so, the Romans claimed that the Carthaginians were being too slow or not fully paying their indemnity to the Romans, and so they then seized Corsica and Sardinia as well. So again, you can see these three large islands in the Mediterranean shift from being Carthaginian territories to switching hands to the Romans instead. So this is the First Punic War, but obviously the title of the slide is the Punic Wars. There are more wars to be fought between Carthage and Rome, and they're obviously going to be fought by Hannibal. So Rome and Carthage were soon at war again, or at least in the next 25 years or so. So Roman Carthage, I mean, no one really lived through all three of these wars, but about 25 years after the end of the first one, the second Roman and Carthaginian war broke out, the Second Punic War. But this time, Carthage had a kind of an advantage, or certainly had a secret weapon, and that was Hannibal. Hannibal was a general in the Carthaginian army. He's widely acknowledged today as one of the most capable commanders of the ancient world, and he built that reputation in some ways because of his exploits during the Second Punic War. So Hannibal was a skilled general, and he decided that rather than trying to fight a battle at sea where Roman naval superiority was now established, that Rome was actually vulnerable to attack by land. That if they weren't expecting the Carthaginians to attack them by land, and so he decided to invade Italy in 218 BC. And not just invade Italy, he had a group of about 36 war elephants amongst his other forces that he led over the Alps into Italy. The story of Hannibal and his elephants oftentimes captures the imagination of a lot of people. It has to be said that only 1 or 2 elephants survived the climb through the Alps. That a lot of elephants actually died before they got to the Alps. A lot more elephants died in the Alps. It was only a couple of elephants actually survived crossing the Alps and turning out into Italy itself. So actually their influence on at least Hannibal's campaign in Italy was somewhat limited. There's a video here that I think it's going to come up now that I would show you normally, but because of copyright issues again on YouTube, I'm not going to attempt to show it. But basically it talks about how the Carthaginians essentially got the elephants drunk before every battle, and that when an elephant is kind of intoxicated, he drank wine and went out charging against its enemies. It was on the one hand a very effective weapon of war, but its major downside was that it's very hard to control, that it doesn't see any difference between the Romans and the Carthaginians. And so the guys who kind of who sat on top of the elephants oftentimes was sat up there with a giant kind of spike or chisel, that if the elephant went rampaging in the wrong direction, it was their job to actually kind of kill the elephant and bring the elephant down. So that's the video, but unfortunately we're not going to watch it today. Hannibal occupies Rome for 15 years and he wins many major battles. In fact, the Romans find that for a long time, that essentially they cannot defeat Hannibal, despite the fact that they outnumber Hannibal, despite the fact that they're on home territory. Hannibal is I guess, to use a modern football euphemism or sports euphemism, he's on the road. Hannibal is a much more effective general. The most famous battle of Hannibal against the Romans was the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC. So at the Battle of Cannae, the Roman army outnumbered firstly the Carthaginians. It was probably about 80,000 men against 55,000 men or so. The Romans are on the left in red, the Carthaginians are on the right in blue. Essentially, what Hannibal did was he allowed the centre of his army to fall back. And the Romans kind of pursued the centre of his army, believing they had him in retreat. But actually, what was happening was that the flanks of the army were all the time working around, and eventually the Roman army was encircled. So you can see here that they pushed back the cavalry at the centre of Hannibal's army, but they allowed themselves to become surrounded, and in surrounded they were essentially slaughtered. Estimates kind of vary, but some people believe as many as 70,000 of the 80,000 Roman soldiers died and another 10,000 were captured. So this Roman army was entirely annihilated by Hannibal. Hannibal's losses, by comparison, only about 5,000 or so. So an enormous slaughter at the Battle of Cannae. The Romans couldn't defeat Hannibal, so how did they eventually get him to leave Italy? They firstly adopted what we call the Fabian strategy in military affairs. That's to say that they realized that Hannibal's kind of advantage was battle, that he kept defeating them in battle, that they couldn't overcome Hannibal in battle. So instead they adopted a kind of more of a scorched earth policy, tried to harass him and kind of to deny his army supplies, rather than trying to take him on head on in battle. Even then, Hannibal hung on in Italy, and eventually, in order to get him to leave Italy, they decided, well, the best course of action is to attack Carthage itself in Africa. That's the only way he's ever going to leave Italy. And so the Roman army, which crossed over from Spain into Africa, was led by a guy called Scipio. Scipio was the Roman commander of this army. Hannibal, once he learns that Carthage is being invaded or attacked, rushes back home to try and defend his army. And at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, Hannibal faces off against Scipio. This time he's recovered his war elephants, or he's gotten more war elephants. But Scipio, as he was wont to do as a Roman general, had learned the lessons of past mistakes, that once the war elephants began charging at Scipio and his men, he had simply trained his men to stand aside. And so the idea was that the elephants would go rampaging through, the Romans would stand aside, and then of course it's kind of impossible to control the elephants. They're just going to keep going, and so that he could negate the effect of these war elephants. So Rome won the Second Punic War. By this stage, Carthage was reduced to a kind of small trading city and nothing more. But even then, it remained kind of at least in Roman eyes, a potential threat against the Roman Republic, and so there was always kind of people calling for Carthage to be attacked again and to be finished off, even though it was no longer really a rival to Rome itself. One Roman senator became known as Cato the censor. Censor was the ancient Roman word for advise or advisor, and it was because every time he made a speech, no matter what the topic was, he would always finish his speech by saying, and furthermore, I advise that we destroy the city of Carthage. And so that became known as Cato the advisor or the censor, because he was always advising Rome to attack and destroy Carthage. Eventually, they provoke a final war. Again, this is 50 years after the end of the Second Punic War. But they provoke a final war against Carthage in 149 BC. They utterly destroy the city, and in fact, according to legend, they raise the city with salt. That's to say that they plough through the city, they plant salt, so not only will the city not recover, but nothing can ever really grow there again. Hannibal, crossed the Alps with a herd of elephants and thus invaded Africa. After they defeated Carthage, the Romans brutally salted the people, that is, not salted the ground, and razored the city. Scipio was called Africanus because he served in Spain. Scipio did serve in Spain, and he does get the nickname Africanus, but he gets the nickname Scipio Africanus because of his service in Africa, not in Spain. Okay. Once the Romans had kind of conquered Carthage, in some ways they kind of find themselves kind of getting drawn more and more into conflicts elsewhere in the Mediterranean. This is one of the great debates of the ancient Roman world. That was the empire on the one hand, was the empire where they kind of conquering new territories constantly because they had to essentially provide new conquests to provide soldiers for, or provide territory for their ever-expanding army, and there certainly could be an element of that. Or was it that once they conquered a territory, then there was security concerns over this new territory, and then they had to conquer the next territory to protect security for, or provide security for this first territory, which then was kind of an endless cycle of conquest and an endless cycle of conquest. So they added Greece to the territories of the Roman Empire, and actually we'll say more on the Greeks in a little bit. And they also conquered parts of the Middle East as well. And all of these conquests brought a vast number of slaves to Rome. My question for you is, what kind of impact does this have on Rome's economy? And the answer is that so military success brought a huge number of slaves to Italy. So by about 100 BC or so, there were 1 million slaves operating in Italy. This radically alters the economy because for a couple of reasons. Firstly, larger, richer aristocrats, because they're able to buy more slaves, their economic output from their farms outstrips that of the ordinary Roman farmer, who has to kind of do his own labor. And because those Roman farmers, those small Roman farmers, find themselves kind of being outcompeted, they eventually sell their land. The introduction of slaves also, in some ways, kind of dampens down innovation. That the Romans, because they don't really have to innovate in terms of providing kind of crafty solutions to manpower shortages, because there's a vast number of slaves. But those Romans who sell their land and then go into the city, try to find a better way of living for themselves, also find themselves essentially competing against, they're competing for low-paying jobs because the slavery trade is so prosperous in Rome that there's little kind of, anything that can be done with like basic menial kind of work is done by slaves. And so actually a large number of unemployed people emerge in ancient Rome as well, and they need to be treated, need to be kind of taken care of. And this is where the Roman grain dole becomes a thing. That's they provided an amount of grain so the Romans could make enough bread. And again, a huge number of people in ancient Rome were actually drawing the dole at the height of the empire around the first century or so AD. The new trade networks opened up by the empire. Again, for the first time, this is when the Romans began to switch their minds. They switched their minds from focusing on agriculture to focusing on trade. In some ways, trade became the new career of choice. So again, they're slower than the Greeks or the Phoenicians to take up this kind of craft, but they do get there eventually. Ancient Rome itself kind of had laws that actually proscribed or forbid politicians from engaged in trade. And so if you were a member of a rich aristocratic family, you could go into politics, but politics in some ways was oftentimes not a great paying job. Business was much more lucrative, and what oftentimes frequently happened in practice was that one brother or some brothers would go into politics, other brothers would go into business, but the brothers in business would bankroll the brothers involved in politics. And so those who were involved in politics as well eventually became known as equestrians, and the equestrians reflects the fact that they were expected to, not that they were expected to ride into battle themselves as horsemen, but they were able to expected to provide for the outfitting of Roman cavalrymen, because they had to be taxed more because of their wealth was greater, and so they became essentially known as equestrians, and that was kind of the ideal kind of choice for Rome, at least among some Romans, not all, but some. The introduction to the Greek world also had a profound impact on Rome itself, that, as sometimes happens, that the Romans themselves came to realize that compared to the Greeks, their own kind of culture was somewhat primitive. They didn't have the same kind of wealth of literature or poetry or things like that, or arts or kind of philosophy that the ancient Greeks had. And so a lot of Romans began to essentially learn Greek. Bilingualism became very important, especially again amongst the upper classes. So to be able to speak Greek was a sign of that someone was truly civilized, and slaves who could speak Greek and who could teach their children Greek, teach the Roman children Greek, became kind of a highly desirable kind of commodity on the Roman slave market. Of course, what was the reaction of some people to the changing way that Romans were living their lives? Well, some people essentially thought, and as often happens in all societies, in all places, that the new way of doing things was soft. They felt that the Romans were kind of forgetting their origins, forgetting their kind of hardy, farm-based, military-based kind of identity, and instead were becoming soft, speaking Greek instead of Latin, practicing poetry and literature instead of practicing martial kind of combat or martial kind of tactics. And again, although I said so this was certainly something that existed in ancient Rome, a sense that something was being lost, that Rome was getting softer, but with the caveat that exists in all societies at all times. There's a sense that the youth of today and their ways are somehow softer than what had gone before. We're also going to talk in this class about populares versus optimates. That's to say that as the kind of Roman Empire became ever more wealthy, kind of a conflict arose at the top of Roman society between those who tried to harness popular power, power of essentially the plebeians, in order to kind of establish themselves politically in Rome, and those who tried to kind of harness the power of the upper classes, the optimates, in order to kind of put themselves in the best position to dominate Roman society. Roman upperclassmen demanded to be known as patricia. Senators wore purple tubas as a sign of respect. Senators certainly wore something purple, but it was purple togas, not tubas. And Roman upperclassmen, again, they were known as patricians. They didn't ask to be called patricia. Slightly different thing. There were efforts to reform Rome, and actually one of the efforts to reform Rome was based around the property requirement. In order to be a Roman soldier, and actually in order to be a Roman citizen, there was a property requirement. You had to own a certain amount of land in order to serve in the Roman army. The logic behind this was that someone who owned their own land was invested in the security of the state. They didn't want wild political ideas getting out of hand, that they already had a kind of stake in society, and therefore they could be best trusted to defend the status quo. However, the property requirement eventually became a problem, and why was this? The problem was that as fewer Romans as more and more land was getting bought up by wealthy aristocrats, as more and more Roman citizens essentially lost the status of citizenship, the demands on the army were becoming increasingly strained, that there was a need for more and more men, but actually less Romans were eligible than before. And so the Gracchus brothers, who were operating in the 2nd century BC, began putting forward some radical demands towards, firstly, redistributing land. They proposed a law. Tiberius at first, and then his younger brother Gaius, proposed a law that would limit the amount of land any one person could own. And in fact, in some ways, that wasn't new. That law actually existed in time, but they began trying to reinforce it and enforce it more kind of substantially. And so they essentially proposed to redistribute land amongst the poorer people of Rome, because that would firstly increase the size of the army, and it would be a powerful step towards ending unemployment that occupied the city of Rome, because again, Rome was giving out large amounts of grain by this stage to the unemployed of the city. So Tiberius Gracchus was the first to kind of propose this idea, and he was assassinated by powerful and wealthy Roman aristocrats, who obviously were alarmed by his idea to essentially break up these vast estates and to redistribute them in a more kind of egalitarian form. So he was assassinated in 133. His brother Gaius came along about a decade later. Some of the reforms had actually been introduced between Tiberius and Gracchus, more moderate reforms, but reforms were introduced nevertheless. And so Gaius instead took the idea that, well, citizenship, he was trying to break the connection between land ownership and Roman citizenship, and he was also proposing to extend the Latin right, Roman citizenship, to all the people of the Italian peninsula. Again, this would have substantially altered the status quo of the governance of Rome, and Gaius, like Tiberius, was assassinated. Him and actually about 3,000 of his followers were assassinated in 121 BC. A couple of decades later, Marius comes along. So Marius becomes consul. He's from a patrician background as well. He becomes consul in 107 BC, and he actually introduces some very significant reforms into the Roman army that actually changes. They were known as the Marian reforms. Substantially changed the structure of the army. What exactly were his reforms? And that's my question for you. What do you think Marius did to reform the army? He essentially eliminated the property requirement. You no longer had to own land in order to serve in the Roman army, and this opened up a huge number and a huge reservoir of unemployed people for service in the Roman army, many of whom were very willing and able to serve in the Roman army. But it also changed the dynamics of how the Roman army actually functioned. What kind of people do you think were attracted to the army, and where did the loyalty of these soldiers ultimately lie? So firstly, it was attracted kind of unemployed people who essentially were out to make a living, people who were desperate to earn a living. And that mattered in so much as that because they were desperate to earn a living, they didn't have the same sense of loyalty to Rome itself that maybe the older kind of soldiers did, who had to own property in order to serve in the Roman army. In particular, their loyalty lay not so much to Rome, but to their generals, the guys who provided the plunder and provided the money and paid their wages and gave them kind of free rein to kind of steal and plunder when they were on campaign. And so that when push comes to shove, the army is going to increasingly become an influential element in Roman politics in a way that had not been up until this point. So Marius made a powerful enemy in Sulla. So Sulla was another patrician from patrician background. He was supposed to serve in the army of Asia. He actually had served in the social wars of the late or the early 90s BC, the late 80s BC. That's where a number of Italian cities rebelled against Rome because essentially they weren't citizens, and Sulla helped subdue some of these rebellions. He was supposed to be awarded the command of the army of Asia, which obviously would have made him wealthy as well. But Marius, kind of out of a combination of some concern about Sulla, but really more motivated by jealousy, denied Sulla the command of the army. And then Sulla essentially put into practice what I just said. He bet that his own men would be much more loyal to him than to the concept of Rome itself, and so he marched his army on Rome. Marius obviously was getting a bit old by this stage, so he died not long after Sulla attacked the city of Rome. Sulla made himself dictator, and not just dictator for a 6-month period, as had been the kind of norm in times of crisis up until then, but he actually made himself dictator for life when he took power in 83 BC. What reforms did Sulla introduce? Well, Sulla, again, he was of a patrician class, so he increased the power of the Roman Senate. He essentially allowed the Roman Senate to overrule the plebeian assembly, and so essentially that's a major shift of power back towards the Roman Senate. He reduced the power of the people's tribunes, that is, the people's tribunes who were elected by the plebeian assembly, reduced their power in the Roman government, and to essentially make them kind of subservient to the whims of the Roman Senate. He packed the Roman Senate with his own followers. Some of his followers some of the members of the Senate had died during the wars between Marius and Sulla. He then packed it with his replacements, and he finally resigned in 81 BC. So he considered all his aims had been completed, and he stepped aside. And so Sulla is kind of a warning of what can happen when someone is ambitious enough and has enough military support that they can overthrow, in some ways, centuries of tradition in Rome and begin to reshape the city in their own kind of mold. He resigned, so the warning to others may have been only temporary, because his rule was temporary, but someone else is going to come along, and essentially we're kind of setting the stage for eventually what will become the Roman Empire. That we're not going to 100% get there in this class, but we are going to set the stage for which the declaration of the Roman Empire can take place the following year, or the following class, excuse me. So the next major conflict, and the last major conflict we'll look in today's class, is between Pompey and Caesar. So Pompey was a friend of Sulla, he was an ally of Sulla, and he was elected consul alongside Crassus. So Crassus and Sulla, so this is Pompey on the left. This is not Crassus, this is Sulla. But Crassus was a powerful, wealthy man. In fact, he was the wealthiest man in Rome. He was elected in 70 BC. He was elected because he actually just defeated someone. So Crassus is known in the history as the man who finally defeated this great slave revolt. And who led this great slave revolt? And the answer is Spartacus. So the legend of Spartacus and his great slave revolt of the 70s BC that was eventually defeated by the soldiers, loyal to Crassus. And then, so they ruled as consuls for about a decade or so. They were joined by a third powerful, young, wealthy aristocrat called Julius Caesar in 60 BC. Julius Caesar actually was a nephew of Marius. So again, in the same way that Pompey was a friend of Sulla, Julius Caesar was actually related to Marius. And the three of these men established the first triumvirate. So the first kind of triumvirate, essentially they took control and split power between the three of them over the government of Rome. And for a time, they managed to successfully balance power between the three men. But once Crassus dies in the early 50s BC, I think in 53 BC, Caesar and Pompey are left as sole rivals. The Caesar himself actually invaded the Roman territory, or not the Roman territory, the territory of Gaul, which is modern France, in 56 BC. And he fought there for 6 or 7 years and made himself very wealthy. So he was doing both things. He was trying to annex the territory of Gaul to the Roman Empire, but of course he was lining his own pockets as well. He became very wealthy. Sorry, excuse me. I guess I'm getting hit by tiredness near the end of this lecture. He became very wealthy. And because of his wealth, and because he was always sending back, he was actually a great propagandist as well. That he wrote a book on the Gallic Wars, in which he essentially highly praised his own role in fighting Rome's Gallic enemies and eventually defeating them and conquering the province of Rome, which made him very popular. Pompey, however, was the one in Rome itself. And when Crassus died in 53 BC, now there's a kind of real dynamic where there are two men, Caesar and Pompey, both vying to be kind of ultimately the dictator of Rome. Pompey is in Rome itself, and he managed to have himself proclaimed sole consul in 51 BC, and he declared that Caesar was a traitor to Rome and an outlaw. And the gauntlet had been thrown down to Caesar. How would he kind of respond? and he decided to march his army on Rome. Traditionally, the Rubicon was an army in to the north of Rome itself, and I guess I gave away the answer to the question. But Caesar crossed the Rubicon. He brought his army across the Rubicon, which was a signal to Pompey and others that he was not backing down. That he was actually going to use violence to conquer the city of Rome itself. And so the expression today is to cross the Rubicon is to go beyond the point of no return. And to lay bare that you're especially the context of you're no longer kind of loyal to the traditional values of the country. So he crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC. This forced Pompey to flee Rome itself, and Caesar became the undisputed leader of the city of Rome, although Pompey was still alive. And so a civil war broke out between Pompey and Caesar, which was to last a couple of years. But Caesar managed to conquer Rome itself, and from that point on, he's largely on the front foot in the Roman Civil War. Upon crossing the Rubicon in 49 BC, Caesar declared Alia Iacta Est, which means this. And what does this mean? It means the die is cast, the dice are cast. So the dice is singular, die are plural. I've thrown the dice, I've made my gamble, and now let's see where the dice falls or where the chips land. That in crossing the Rubicon, he did take a risk. He was breaking Roman law, essentially, but it worked out for him that he managed to conquer the city of Rome. Other famous Latin expressions also associated with Caesar. So when Caesar won a quick victory against the kingdom of Pontus in 47 BC, and Pontus was around essentially in northern modern Turkey. So he won a quick war against the kingdom of Pontus, and he informed the Senate of his victory with this three-word phrase. What was this three-word phrase? Veni vidi vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. And Caesar inspired his men by saying, I came, I saw, I went. Not exactly. So, Caesar chased Pompey firstly to Greece, where he fought with him, defeated him in battle, and eventually Pompey tried to flee to Egypt, and he hoped to get the help of the Egyptian pharaoh, a young man named Ptolemy XIII. Ptolemy XIII actually killed Pompey because he believed that Caesar had obviously won the war by that stage, and he hoped to kind of curry favour with Caesar. Pompey himself, or sorry, not Pompey, Ptolemy himself, Ptolemy XIII, was engaged in something of a civil war against his sister, vying for power in Egypt, and his sister's name was Cleopatra. So in pursuing, I gave away the answer to another question. In pursuing Pompey, Caesar became the lover of this woman who bore him a son, Caesarion, and the answer to that obviously is Cleopatra. So he took sides in the war. He took Cleopatra's side. Obviously, he was sleeping with Cleopatra, so he took his side over Ptolemy the 13th. In fact, Ptolemy the 13th, he was only a teenage boy anyway. But Caesar helped Cleopatra win. Ptolemy was drowned in the river, and then Cleopatra ruled technically under the guidance of her younger brother, again, Ptolemy the 14th, because whoever became pharaoh, they took the title or they took the name Ptolemy, but really she was able to govern Egypt largely by herself. And Julius Caesar came back having defeated Pompey, having added Rome, or at least adding Egypt to Rome's territories as well. He came back and it was a spectacular triumph held for him. So a triumph was a very rare honour that the city of Rome gave to the people of, or gave to one of its successful generals. It was one of the few times when the Roman soldiers, unarmed, were allowed to march through the city. They oftentimes marched the enemies of the Roman general through the city as well, and actually Vercingetorix, who had been captured a couple of years earlier, was paraded through the city, and then he was executed in the Colosseum by being garroted, by being executed from actually I said the Colosseum, it wasn't the Colosseum, but he was executed in the public forum by being strangled. Caesar would have paraded around in a crown of gold, but as was a Roman tradition, a servant stood beside Caesar the entire time, and the servant had one job, and that was to whisper this phrase in Caesar's ear: memento mori, remember you will die. And the idea was, this was the ancient Romans saying, okay, well, this is a great triumph, a great honor being established for you. But remember, you will die. That don't forget your mortality. Don't forget your kind of place in the wider kind of cosmos. Don't kind of get notions of immortality, basically. Caesar kind of expanded Roman citizenship even further. He expanded it amongst some of his Spanish allies and other parts. So Roman citizenship is now being extended not just through the Italian peninsula, but even further afield. He filled the Roman Senate with his supporters. He took the title of dictator, again, initially for a 10-year period, but then that was changed in 44 BC for dictator for life. So he's essentially going to rule as king in all but name. And he was very popular amongst the ordinary Roman people, but among some members of the Roman Senate, this all sounded too much like Caesar, in fact, was planning to be a monarch. And he was planning to overthrow centuries of Roman tradition, even though the tradition itself had been pretty badly sullied by first Marius and then Sulla, essentially ruling as sole consuls, Pompey doing the same. But some people felt that Caesar had gone even further. As a result, some of the senators of Rome began to conspire to assassinate him. They were led by a man called, Cassius was nominally the leader, but a guy called Brutus was an important conspirator, because Brutus was descended from the original Brutus, who had played a leading role in taking out Tarquin Superbus as the Roman king centuries earlier. So this was there was a kind of the participation of Brutus in an assassination attempt on Julius Caesar was giving legitimacy to the action by kind of saying, here's another Roman king planning to take over Rome, and therefore it's called for another Brutus to stop this Roman king. Again, this is going to play, or at least it would play, a short clip from the HBO series Rome, where Julius Caesar is assassinated. I can't play it, but a group of senators assassinate Caesar on the floor of the Senate in 44 BC. And so they take Caesar by surprise and assassinate him. It was actually done on the Ides of March. I'll say a bit more on that in a second. And Caesar, actually, the first known autopsy to world history was performed on Julius Caesar after he was assassinated, and he was found to have 23 stab wounds on his body. And that was the music was playing, and I guess so let me go back. So made a mess of that, but the knife music playing in the background. Okay, so the Romans used 3 points in a month to count the days: the nones, the calends, and this. Caesar was assassinated on it on the March 44 BC. I already gave away this question as well. There was the Ides of March. So the Romans had the first day of the month was the calends. I think it was the 8th day of the month was the nones, and then usually the 15th of the month was the Ides, and that's how Romans kind of told time. So they basically didn't have individual days, names for each days. They basically said, it's 2 days before the nones, or it's 3 days before the Ides, or it's 10 days before the calends. That's how the Roman calendar worked. Caesar was assassinated on the Yikes of March. Not exactly, it was the Ides of March. And according to Shakespeare, Shakespeare had Caesar utter these words as he was stabbed. Now a common phrase to express that someone has been betrayed. Et tu, Brute? What is et tu, Brute? What is an you, Brutus? So in other words, that Caesar sees he's being attacked by these conspirators, but he actually considered Brutus a friend, and so he's surprised that Brutus is amongst the conspiracy, and so that's why he asks. He has et tu, Brute, and you too, Brutus. That you're kind of one of my betrayers, and then I'm going to die, and he kind of dies after that. Or as one student of history remembered it, when he was assassinated, Caesar was reported to have said, "Me too, Brutus." Not exactly what Caesar said, or at least what Shakespeare had Caesar saying. Okay, that is the end of today's class. Thank you very much for your attention, and we will be discussing the onset of the Roman Empire in our next class, and that class will be meeting in person.